I have to say that give a great deal of credit to luck and to good timing because when on Persephone's, I mean, I was told by the first editor I talked to about on Persephone's Island. She said to me, "Well, this was in '82. You know, nobody wants to read a book about Sicily." And then I was lucky enough to be handed from my sister to somebody she'd met at a dinner party who turned out to be an editor, who then handed me to a junior editor, and then he couldn't sell his seniors on it because they said it's not a book. And then he handed me to my agent, who was good friends with the top editors in New York. And right along, my whole life has been just one serendipitous turn after another that was not plotted out at all.
Fascinating people with stories to share, fabulous wines and the best local foods to accompany them, and beautiful places to discover and visit. All of this and more on Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast. Join me for a new episode every Tuesday. Welcome to Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on Italian Wine Podcast. Today I'm traveling to Western Sicily, to Partinico, more precisely to Bosco Falconeria, to meet my guest and dear friend, Mary Taylor Simeti, author and authority on Sicilian food and food history, and also farmer, winemaker, proprietor with husband Tonino and daughter Natalia of this biodiverse organic farm that produces fabulous wines, olive oil, artisan wine vinegar, citrus fruits, avocados, and more. I was just at Bosco a few weeks ago, and we're always welcomed so warmly by you, Mary, but it's always a hectic day, so it's nice to have a quieter moment to chat. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for wrestling with some of the technological hurdles that communicating in this way can sometimes throw up. And I'm really delighted to be here with you today. How are you today?
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you in a more peaceful setting than and when you're here with the group. And I apologize for being too old to leap easily over technological hurdles.
I'm having the same problems.
Difficulty.
Yeah, no, we've got there in the end, and it isn't easy because we've had to download software and check settings, but we're talking now, which is really delightful. Mary, first of all, because our listeners are located all around the world and they'll be tuning in from anywhere you could imagine, take us to Bosco Falconeria. Tell us where you are, what the countryside is like, what the farm is like.
Well, I always say that I ended up in the most beautiful places in the world. The farm is about halfway between Palermo and Trapani, on a hill overlooking a plain that overlooks the Gulf of Castellamare, so overlooks the Mediterranean. We can see, if we stand on the edge of our, let's say, parking lot, we can look across olive groves and vineyards that stretch down, and then we see the sea beyond, and we can see the Faro, the light that marks the Capo San Vito, which is the northwestern point of Sicily. And then all around us are mountains. So it's quite spectacular in its views and very, very beautiful. The plain of the Gulf of Castellamare was one of the great oak forests of Sicily, and it was only cut down, and the forest was cut down, and farming was put in the, I think, the 16th century. And so it isn't like the center of Sicily with enormous feudal holdings of grain, of maybe wheat. It's small holdings that were given out by the feudal lords, or not given, lent, sold out. A small farm, so it's a very, very much of a checkerboard landscape, which makes it very interesting.
Yes, I didn't know about the oak forests and the fact that the land tenure was different in this part of Sicily compared to the vast feudal estates that are found. And some of the other wine estates are really, really quite vast. Mary, before we begin talking more about that, I'd like you to share your own personal story because after graduating from Radcliffe, from Harvard, with a major in history, you came to Sicily in 1962 as a volunteer in a community development center. Why Sicily? What drew you to come to this incredible island?
Well, on the one hand, I was interested in Sicily because I majored in medieval history and had done my senior honors thesis on Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was half Sicilian, Norman Sicilian. And I had been fascinated by him and curious about Sicily. I took it for granted that I would be going on to graduate school after I finished my bachelor's degree, but I was undecided between going on in medieval history, which I loved, or doing something that would be helpful in the area of development work. I graduated in 1962, which was sort of the very height of the American Peace Corps enthusiasm. I'd done a lot of volunteer social work while I was at college, and I was very interested in the whole question of development work, work in the third world. I was didn't want to go as the representative of the American way of life. I wanted to go to find out what their way of whoever it was. I wanted to know about them rather than trying to apply my own business. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
so I didn't want to go with the Peace Corps, and I tried for a job with Save the Children and other things, and they all said medieval history. That's no preparation. And the only place I could go was this center run by a man named Danilo Dolce in Sicily, which took volunteers. And so I came and I volunteered here, and I thought it was going to be a year or two, and then I was going to go back to the States and go to graduate school. But I met a man, and that was that. And I've been here ever
Yeah.
since.
Yeah.
I married a
Well,
man
it's
who's
it.
an agronomist and taught taught cultural economy at the university.
Mary, I was going to read from one of your books a little bit later, but I think I'm going to read from the prologue of a Sicilian journal on Persephone's Island because it's such an evocative moment in your life. Can I just read you just a few paragraphs from the opening of your book? This is the prologue, October 1962. So, this is that moment you're describing to us now.
Yes, my arrival in Sicily, which was dramatic.
Yes. Like most young Americans traveling abroad in the early 60s, I arrived in Sicily with an excessive number of suitcases, considerable ignorance, and a great many warnings. In college, I had studied the Sicilian Middle Ages, and over the summer, I had read about Sicilian poverty in the writings of Danilo Dolci, the social reformer at whose Center for Community Development I hoped to volunteer. This kernel of fact, meagre as it was, had been fleshed out by the cautionary tales of friends and acquaintances, both at home and in the north of Italy, who all considered me courageous, if not downright foolish, to set off by myself for an island of dazzling sun and bright colors, where bandits and mafiosi lurked in the shadows, and where the rest of the population was proud and reserved, distrustful of foreigners, and sure to misinterpret the presence of a young girl alone. It was a courageous thing to do in the 60s, then, Mary, and really a great adventure for you. Sicily must have presented itself as an entire. You came from Cambridge, Massachusetts, virtually to Palermo, which I imagine in the 60s was very, very different than it is now.
All of Sicily was very different then. The poverty was still extreme. I had very little to do with Palermo. I was in a town called Partinico, which actually is where I am now. I'm not in the town, but I'm in the territory of the town of Partinico. It was in some ways scary. It was adventurous. I have to say that the Sicilians are absolutely lovely with foreigners. They're very welcome. In those days, there was relatively little tourism in Sicily. People were afraid to come to Sicily. But I, from the very beginning, was accepted, was helped in really quite extraordinary ways. And that makes a big difference. It really does. I
Sure,
did
of
not have to
course.
fight any kind of prejudice or antipathy or
Did you speak Italian at that
I did
stage?
not terribly well, but I did speak it. I'd studied it in college, and the summer after I graduated, before I got to Italy at the beginning of July and came down in October, and the months in between, I was doing conversation lessons in Florence, and so I could. I certainly didn't speak Sicilian, which is
Of course, of course.
uh, halfway between being a dialect and being a language of its own. And it's a spectrum. Some people mix in a lot of Italian, and some people speak a very tight dialect, depending on their education, whether they're country or urban. Lots of different factors go into it. But I spent a long time saying yes to things that my landlord said to me in Nico, without knowing whether I was agreeing to a raise in the rent or not, because I couldn't
Right.
understand a word he
Yeah.
said.
So, Mary, you met Tonino that year. Was Tonino involved in the community center, or is he already teaching in Palermo?
He had applied to a job there a year before and been accepted and was had been about to start when he got news that he'd been given a scholarship to do a year of postgraduate work at Naples. But he had many friends who were working there and hung out. And in those days, theoretically, Sicilian girls weren't allowed to date, to go out by themselves with men. And so the foreign girls that came to work at the center were in demand. And I learned 5 years after we were married that he had reserved, put down, dibbed me before he ever saw me, which was risky, but
Oh, that's funny. You then moved to Palermo and raised a family, but you were coming to Bosco regularly to the
yes.
family farm. So the family farm was in Tonino's family since when, Mary?
Well, this farm, Tonino's grandfather bought in 1930. He was a landowner with vineyards everywhere, and above all, somebody who made and sold wine. And he bought this in 30 and directed everything there until he died in 1948. And Tonino's oldest brother took over, but he was not a good businessman, and the farm was sort of went a bit downhill. And we had no intention of staying in Sicily. We were going to go and do development work throughout the third world. Tonino had already put in an application to the FAO for a job as an agronomist with them. And then the eldest brother died very suddenly 2 years after we were married, and so we had the farm and his parents who were aging and not very well. So that was the end of going around the third world. And in the beginning, it was an obligation, but the more time we put in here and the more energy we put in, the more it became a passion. And in 1968, there was a bad earthquake in this area, and the house, which was old and hadn't been kept up since the death of the grandfather, got some bad cracks. I mean, we couldn't go up to the upper floor anymore because the stairs were going to give way under us. And we were able to launch a project for the farm and the house with the help of the government as earthquake victims, which allowed us to make it into a place where we could live. We thought in during vacations.
Right, because Tonino was still teaching then.
Tonino was teaching at the university. We were came out every weekend, but we didn't sort of think about it permanently, but then it became clear that was really, we liked it better. And when Natalia, the younger of our two children, finished high school and went off to the university in Viterbo, we decided that it wasn't worth keeping two houses going, that we would move out here permanently. I had the mistaken idea that I would have an easier time. I had begun writing by that time. This was in 1990. I'd begun writing, and I thought I was going to have more time to write here with less interruptions. That turned out to be a total illusion, but anyway.
Sure.
So,
Mary, I want to go back in time and back to when you came over in your 20s. And you know Sicilian food so intimately. You write about it beautifully. You've brought Sicilian food to people around the world. But I'm just thinking how food was for you when you came over in the 1960s, coming from America, the land of plenty, the land of industrial food, of convenience food, to another way of interacting with food, food that's made from produce that's grown the land, and with traditions that, as you write about, go back literally 2,500 years, maybe longer.
well, in the first place, I had spent a certain amount of time in Europe before I came here. I was used to eating. Well, my father had spent a lot of time in France and he wanted to eat well. And too, in up until in the 50s, industrial food was just beginning. It begins with the developments that took place during the Second World War. And things came in. I can remember my mother being thrilled with frozen orange juice because it tasted so much better than the stuff. There was things that frozen things that were novelties in the 50s, but were really much flavorful, much nicer than canned peas. God, they're awful. Partly that, partly because I was used to, partly because I like to eat and I like to try new foods. So I really didn't have anything problems that I had to overcome eating here. I was also lucky because at the center, many of the people with whom I became friends were Italians. They weren't other foreigners. So I was learning about Italian cooking when I was at their houses, or, when we ate together. I never meant to become a food writer. That was, and I'm still uneasy with that term because I have no training in food whatsoever. When I had to sign the contract for the publication of On Persephone's Island, which the book that you read a piece from, my agent explained to me that the first year, while you waited until the book came out, was difficult, especially for a new writer, a beginning writer. And he suggested that I find something that would be not a huge job, but would keep my mind off what was happening with Persephone. And I said, well, actually, in researching Persephone, I've gotten sort of interested in the anthropology of olive oil and the myths and the rites involved, and with bread. And I was going to write 3 short essays. And I started to work. And the more research I did, the more interested I got. And I ended up 3 years later with a book entitled Pomp and Sustenance 25 Centuries of Sicilian Food. And not exactly 3 light essays. Um,
In fact, Mary, when I visited you, I always enjoy, one of the things I enjoy most is the most exquisite and the freshest ricotta cheese that I think you've say is made on that day. But you, in fact, have shared with the people I've brought out a reading, in fact, from the Odyssey and linking cheese making, ricotta cheese making, this simple way of draining the whey.
I was very lucky. I mean, if I had married somebody who worked in Palermo and didn't have any ties to the land, I would never have learned all the things that I learned. It turned out that I knew a great deal more than I was aware that I knew, just because of having spent weekends and summers on the farm, and because of Tonino's work. And actually, I decided to write because I had been asked by Radcliffe to accompany a trip of alumni around the island. And this, I was terrified because I knew I hadn't learned all the, I couldn't tell you how many columns there were in Temple of Segesta, or how much mosaicing there was in an Arab Norman church. But there was an official guide for that. And I found myself telling people as we went by bus around Sicily what was growing in the fields, and how it would be harvested, what the harvest rights were. I didn't even know I knew all this stuff, but I did. And they were fascinated because you can't find out that kind of thing in a guidebook.
And that's what led to On Persephone's Island,
That's
then.
what led to Persephone's Sons, which was supposed to be a sort of a book of months in the medieval sense, a year in the fields of Sicily. But my own story sort of crept in and became a sort of a double-barreled book, of a book about Sicily and a book about being an expatriate in Sicily.
Yeah, no, I really love that. I think maybe as an expatriate myself, I identify with that, adapting to a completely new culture, falling in love with a new culture. But you talk about, as you say, the year from pressing olives in winter and making cheese, that cheese that just talked about, ricotta, religious festivals and feasts. And things were going on then, like the Matanza off the islands of Favignano, the Egadi Islands, and the
Mm.
Tonari. So it really is an insight to another world. I guess the family at Bosco, were they doing these traditional foods, making the tomato sauce every year, enough to keep you going through the year, and the traditional way of cheese,
I
meats?
had never been to Bosco until after my brother-in-law died. Tonino's parents were aging. They did go to where we had an oil press in November. The calendar of the family had been to be in the town of Alcamo during the winter. And then after the Feast of the Madonna in June, everybody went down to the sea, and they had a house at the sea. And then from there, they would move out to Bosco for the wine harvest, and then to another place where the oil press was for the olive harvest, and then back into town in December. But it wasn't a big family. There was never, I mean, there were cousins, but they were never involved in what was going on in my household. And my mother-in-law was in her 70s, not very well, and she must have been a very good cook once, but there were there were some dishes that she were really quite wonderful, and she did very well. But I that's sort of the actual for the making of the tomato sauce in those days. They were workmen who were mezzadri, who were sharecroppers, and who cultivated, as well as the cash crops of grapes and olives, cultivated vegetables for their own use, but some for us too, so that one family always made tomato sauce and gave us some. And one year they left it. It was the summer, and my in-laws were at the beach, but they left crates of tomato bottles of tomato sauce on the stairway going up to the house on the first floor, the apartment on the first floor. And in the heat, they all exploded.
Oh my goodness.
It was quite amazing.
Yes.
I think that's how I really know and remember that it was the Pirellas who it wasn't the Pirellas, who might have been tomato sauce. But I did participate once we started living here, spending summers here. I was very much part of, and it was the workers and us that made it together. I mean, it was a sort of a community.
Of course, of course.
Even after they weren't here anymore, we did maybe 8 or 10 cases of big cases of tomato.
Yes, I remember Natalia telling me that it was part of her childhood as well. I guess, Mary, you didn't intend to become a food writer, nor did you intend to become a farmer, a wine grower. And you and Tonino were pioneers, really, in deciding, really long before many other people were doing it, to farm organically. That must have been presented its own challenges. And not only that, I would have thought in the 80s, even as recently as that, people probably thought you were crazy to try that.
I had gone to see some organic farming places in the States organized by something called a biosphere, which was cultivating within a geodesic Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. Out of curiosity, the people that had created it were friends of my sisters. And I came back very enthusiastic. And Tonino said, "Oh no, no, those are made for different climates. They would never work. Those organic methods would never work here." And then at the university, he had a couple of graduate students who wrote their thesis under him on organic agriculture, and he became curious about it. In those days, there was nothing, there was no certification available. And he got curious about these things. And we started eliminating the pesticides because we couldn't stand the smell of great sacks of pesticides sitting around, and you just knew that they were bad for you. And it was very much of a private choice. And then we discovered the biodynamic system, and we could get certification for the olive oil as being biodynamic, which we did. In those days, certification for wine didn't exist because the founder, Rudolf Steiner, was abstemious and didn't approve of wine, and so there was no biodynamic wine. But we did get certification for our olive oil. And that was in, I think, 89. And in, I think it was 91 that the Italian government created a certificate, saw that organic agriculture was becoming an important thing, and created the certification agency.
Yeah, it's become extremely important, certainly in Sicily, but also now all across Italy. I think 60% of the producers in the Chianti Classico consortium are now certified organic, which is remarkable because, this has happened over the last 25 years. So you were very much pioneers, and particularly with biodynamic farming, which takes organic farming to another level, really, and would have been thought of at the time as a crazy thing to do with some of the, following the planets and the cow horn and the manure and the tea sands. But the results increasingly are recognized as, really, really outstanding. And so you really would have been one of the first to be farming.
We were in Western Sicily, we were among the pioneers. And Sicily now is the most important growing area for organic. I mean, it produces more organic produce than any other region in Italy.
Okay, well, that's really, really
Partially because
interesting.
of the climate is
Sure.
so good. When we are growing 12, sometimes it is like 14 months out of the year, we have things to be harvested and to be sown. And even if we do much less than we used to in vegetables, just for a question of labor. But what has been so interesting is to see that organic agriculture, certified or not, started out as something that was considered for the health nuts who were just being very fussy about what they ate. And now it's recognized as something that is absolutely important for the environment. That industrial agriculture is destroying the environment.
Of course, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's very scary to wonder about what the food production in the future is going to be, frankly, because
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
the United States is running out of water, and it's also the government for a long time encouraged, subsidized the use of industrial sludge, the leftover from sewer treatment, but it's full of the forever plastics and is rendering a great part of the American agricultural is going to have to be put in fallow.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is very concerning that food production globally is such a Such a challenge. I'll turn to another topic, perhaps a rather unsavory and unavoidable topic, and when it comes to speak about Sicily, Western Sicily, where you live and work. You write in Persephone's Island, I think, about threats of farms being blown up, farmers who refuse to pay extortion money to the mafia, and of course about the murders of Pio La Torre or Carlo Alberto della Chiesa, and later Beppino Impastato and Falcone and Borsellino. So you've lived through all of this, and it must have been something that I know when we're in Sicily, we're not aware of that. We don't need to be aware of that, but it was something you were very much couldn't avoid where you are.
Well, I mean, of course, it's changed. Even all that has changed a great deal. When to talk about the mafia or to write about the mafia in the '60s and the '70s was dangerous. They didn't want publicity. The break on violence, which originally existed in that they didn't want the spotlight to be turned on them, was disappeared with the drug trade because the profits were so high that they could buy anybody they wanted just about, and they didn't care anymore about the spot. And that's when they began murdering judges and policemen, which had never happened before in Sicilian history. The '80s was the turning point, and it was quite fascinating to watch. I think nowadays the mafia operates on multinational levels and in a much more industrial level. It has much less to do with agriculture and owning land. There's some places that's still a problem, and I mean, a few years ago, people in our township, someone was killed because he'd refused to sell land. But on the whole, that's not where the activity is. And a lot of the activity, the drug trade, has been passed to the Calabrian or the Neapolitan mafias. But it's still here. It's still scary.
In 2004, Mary, it seemed the people of Palermo wanted to stand up against the mafia, and that was the start of the Addio Pizzo movement, which you were an early signatory of and still are. Tell us about the Addio Pizzo.
Idea Pizza is really quite amazing organization. It was started, I think, at the beginning of this century. We joined it, as I remember, in 2004, 2005, when it was still very young and there were only about 100 signers. What it was the idea to enlist, theoretically, the thing was to enlist the support of consumers to buying from producers of whatever it was or store owners who pledged to denounce any attempts at extortion. And there was a list of stores and of producers who had signed this pledge and who were using this as a badge. And we have on our wine and oil labels, we have the Addio Pizzo logo, which shows that we have pledged to denounce any kind of extortion. In the beginning, it was very much a an act of courage. Well, that makes us sound very courageous. And one of the things that I think I most admire my husband is that he grew up in Sicily, and but he had a family tradition of opposing extortion attempts. And for him to join Adio Pizza, well, didn't think twice. Of course, we'll join.
And it's there now, I think, over 2,000 businesses.
Yeah, there were 100 more or less when we signed up. Now there are 2,000. I think that the most important thing was that they achieved was that a pentito, somebody who turned state witnesses, said 10 years ago, the extortion racket doesn't bother with a DOP. So it just brings down trouble on your head. There are plenty of other fish in the sea. But the idea that belonging to it is a protection is quite amazing. because it was once at the, in the beginning
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
becoming a target
Yeah,
for violence of some kind. And
yeah,
there are people who stood up against it and were killed, and there are people whose lives were turned totally upside down by refusing to or threatening to denounce extortion. But there's been a big change. The change is part of a bigger change, which I think, which I personally give credit to the big Maxi trial that took place in '88, when for the first time ever, there were 300. It was a trial of 350 people accused of being mafios, and a good number of them, including some of the big bosses, were condemned and sent to prison for it.
yes. I remember that trial. They were all in cages in the courtroom, weren't they? It was
Well,
quite a
it was quite amazing because on the one hand, it told people that they weren't that the mafia was not invincible,
mhm.
and it realized. I mean, there was a great deal of public protest and activism that accompanied it. You know, that things can be done if you get together and make a stand. And I think I see very much in that turning something that invests Sicilian food too, because in the '80s you couldn't get at a restaurant. It was very hard to find decent traditional Sicilian food. You could find it in some. We went used to go to a wonderful trattoria that was down on the docks, and it was on the in the port, and there were a lot of it was small, and there were a lot of dock workers, and it was very simple there. But if you went to a middle class restaurant, you'd be served pasta with smoked salmon or with cream
Oh,
and
wow.
caviar, and couldn't find a Sicilian dish for love or money. And I think the fact and the results of the Maxi trial did a great deal for Sicily's pride and reinterest in things Sicilian.
And that is reflected in the food, and I think also in the way Sicilian wine has had such an extraordinary renaissance from having been previously a bulk wine often sent up to beef.
Yes, the cutting wine. It was used to be very hard to drink it. It was so strong
Yeah.
and not very good. That I don't think that came before. That
Hmm.
started with there were a couple of pioneers, Giuseppe Tasca
Diego Planeta.
and actually they were big landowners, aristocratic or almost, and big landowners, and they had the amount of land to produce the kind of grapes they wanted, and they also had the money to put all the new winemaking in motion. And I think that is not necessarily connected
Sure. Yeah.
worse with the change in attitudes towards the mafia. What I think changed a lot there is the common market in the European Union when
Yeah.
suddenly they began to export a lot and discovered that the mafia didn't make good publicity.
Sure. Yeah. I guess technology as well in winemaking was central to that with stainless steel and temperature control
Yeah.
to
Which I mean, also, I mean, a lot is also to do with the health regulations at the EU, which sometimes are negative because they've put a terrible burden on small producers who've been
Mhm.
producing this kind of cheese or that kind of wine for centuries
Yes.
with with oak or
Yes. Yes.
the cheese making. Then
Yeah.
they had to do an album of traditional foods that could be produced with the old methods,
Yeah.
actually, because
So, Mary, I guess over this long period from the 60s to now, you've seen these great changes in Sicilian society, in Italian society. And through it all, you've been writing. Your first book came out in Persephone's Island, came out in 1986, and it's never been out of print, which is a remarkable achievement. I wish I could say the same about my own books published around the same time. And books have followed: Pomp and Sustenance, 25 Centuries of Sicilian Food, which you mentioned. Another book I love and use, I cook from, but I love the stories in it, is Sicilian Food, Recipes from Italy's Abundant Isle. Now, this is a
Now
book
that's the
that,
same as Pomp and Sustenance. It's just the
oh,
English edition.
oh, is that right? Oh, I love this book, and there is so much history in it, as well as practical recipes that really work. I make the squash, the sweet and sour squash that I've had at your house, from this, getting that agro-dolce balance right. That's such an important feature of Sicilian food. But other books as well. This wonderful book you co-wrote with Maria Grammatico, Bitter Almonds, Recollections and Recipes of a Sicilian Girlhood, a really extraordinary story of tenacity and overcoming hardship. Um, Other titles that I haven't seen: Travels with a Medieval Queen, The Journey of a Sicilian Princess to Reclaim Her Father's Crown. Which Sicilian princess was that?
That's the mother of Frederick II,
Oh, Constanza.
who was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry
That's right.
IV.
Roger the Second's daughter. Is that right?
I have to say that I have give a great deal of credit to luck and to good timing, because when on Persephone's, I mean, I was told by the first editor I talked to about on Persephone's Island. She said to me, "Well, this was in '82. You know, nobody wants to read a book about Sicily." She said, I think the mixing in the mythological stuff is a good idea. Why don't you go in that direction? And I said, well, I'm not really qualified to go in that direction. And I'm not really interested in going. But thank you for the nice meal. And then I was lucky enough to be handed from my sister to somebody she'd met at a dinner party, who turned out to be an editor, who then handed me to a junior editor, and then he couldn't sell his seniors on it because they said it's not a book. It doesn't fit into a slot easily. It's not just a travel book, and it's not whatever. And then he handed me to my agent, who was good friends with the top editors in New York. And right along, my whole life has been just one serendipitous turn after another that was not plotted out at all. And nobody had wanted to read a book about Sicily, but once a good, decent book came out that wasn't just talking about mafia or talking about dire poverty, there was a mark, not a huge.
I think that's because of your writing. You write beautifully and draw people in to a tale of, which you have a great in-depth insights and knowledge and intimacy in Sicily, but you bring your words bring everything to life, whether you're writing about the ancient Greeks or the Normans, or yesterday on the farm at Bosco. Today, Bosco is in the very able hands of Natalia. It's a big job for her, but she seems to be both enjoying it and doing a great job. I think the wines, the olive oil, the vinegars are wonderful. And I know that how much work it is. I hope they're selling well too. But it must be a great satisfaction for you and Tonino.
Oh, it was. When I mean, we were quite convinced that neither. We have our elder child is an artist, and he's an American. It was quite clear that much as he loves being on the farm, he had no interest in taking it on. And Natalia was launched on a curatorial museum career, and it was a surprise when she came and said, "No, I want to carry on. And it's been marvelous for us. One, because we've put so much into this place and to see it carried on, and two, because it allows us to stay here two aging people in a quite an isolated situation. But it's a lot of work, and
Yeah.
it's also very problematic, both because the wine market is shrinking, so not just ours, everybody's global.
Everybody. Yeah, that's a
Also because
concern.
climate change is so much here. Last year, I posted on Instagram a photograph of a narcissus in bloom on the 5th of January. And I thought, it's an omen, it's a harbinger of good things to come. Well, the same bulbs are in flower on the 1st of December this year.
Oh my goodness, that's
And,
incredible.
and
Yeah,
frankly, I find that very frightening.
yeah,
My lilac bushes put out a whole bunch of new leaves in November.
yeah. Here
It's
in
not right.
in Southwest England, we're still cutting our lawn, and we've never done that before. This is the first year we're still cutting the lawn in December.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So, we don't know what the future can be for her or for the farm because
Yeah,
I'm not actually overcome by optimism these days. But
yeah, yeah. No, it's a challenging world, I think, in so many ways. But I'm sure we'll have to find ways to overcome the challenges that come.
yeah,
Mary, you've had a remarkable life that you made for yourself in Sicily, and I'm just really grateful you've been able to share it with us today. It's been really nice to have a relaxed time to just chat like we've been doing. So I want to thank you for being our guest today and for sharing your
well,
incredible story and your knowledge. Thank you so much, Mary.
well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it enormously.
Well, great. Well, I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to seeing you again at Bosco. Thank you, Mary.
Absolutely, we're waiting for you.
Thank you. We hope today's episode of Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast has transported you to somewhere special. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your pods. Likewise, you can visit us at ItalianWinePodcast.com. Until next time, chin chin.